I'm Steve Sweetlove and shall be your host today. Firstly, introducing our speakers and taking you through today's agenda. I'll then put your questions to the panel, and finally I'll provide a reminder of how RSM are helping clients in this challenging area and of the support our People Advisory Services team can give you. If you have any questions that our panelists can help you with, as with our other webinars, please do use the Q&A functionality to pose your question, and we will ask and answer as many as time will allow. I'm joined today by my fellow RSM People Advisory Services partners, Susan Ball and Carolyn Brown. Susan is an employment taxes partner and is specialist in helping employers mitigate and manage people-related costs and risks from a taxes point of view. Carolyn is an employment legal partner and is a specialist employment relationships solicitor who heads up our employment legal team at RSM. This has been a constantly evolving area for those of us who have been assisting businesses in obtaining support from these schemes for the last 8 months. We dare to hope that we now have a settled position, and certainly as to the structure of this ongoing support, at least until the end of January 2021, since the current scheme will be reviewed then. On the 5th of November, the day this invite was sent, the government made further significant change by announcing the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme Extension, or CJRSE. It has postponed the Job Support Scheme, or JSS, so you will not be hearing any content from us today, either about large corporates needing to pass a financial impact test, or about an advisory discouragement on dividends or shareholder distributions at entity or group level for corporates whilst claiming grants. Those were both concepts of the JSS, now postponed until after the CJRSE has ended on the 31st of March. They are not facets of the CJRSE, which was announced on the 5th of November. There is also no distinction under the CJRSE, as there was in the JSS, between open or closed sites or businesses, so that won't feature today either. The Job Retention Bonus, CJRB, is no longer going to apply because the government considers there is sufficient retention incentive in the CJRSE. So our focus today is going to be on the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme Extension. That is the only current scheme in play, save for any claims you may still have to make or corrections to your previous claims under CJRS. Just to be clear in terms of our terminology too, the scheme, which started from the 1st of March and ran in 2 parts, first up until the end of June and then to the end of October this year, we call the CJRS. And the new scheme, about which you are going to hear today, called the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme Extension, we shall call the CJRSE. Having said all of the above, I need to also point out that the content you will hear about today was up to date as at 6 p.m. on Monday the 9th of November. We are expecting full government guidance to be published on the 10th of November. Moving on to our agenda. We'll start with an overview of the Job Retention Scheme Extension, delve a little deeper and look at eligibility, agreements, calculations and claims, take a look at claims up until the end of October. We'll then cover the practical issues and an action plan before we move on to your questions. I'll now pass on to Carolyn to get us underway.
Thank you, Steve. As Steve said, our focus on our update webinar today will be on the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme Extension announced on the 5th of November. But you will also hear a little bit towards the end about the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme itself. We now have a fairly settled position, which will be welcome to business. And let's now look at the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme Extension in overview as we know it now. The Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme Extension is going to be with us until the end of March next year. A new feature is that it is also open to those who have not claimed furlough grant before and for employees who were not claimed for previously. So that is a real change from the previous extension to the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme from the 1st of July, which was restricted to those previously fully furloughed for a consecutive 3-week period. I will shortly cover in more detail all of the eligibility criteria for employers and then for employees, and then Susan will take us through how you do the calculations with some examples and the claims timing process. But I wanted just to flag a few key points for you in terms of overview. The scheme will run from the 1st of November to the 31st of March, and claims can be made from 8 AM on the 11th of November. The scheme will be reviewed in January, and we expect any changes will take effect after the end of January 2021. Eligible employees can receive 80% of usual salary for hours not worked, up to a cap of £2,500 a month, and that will run from the 1st of November to the 31st of January, because that's when there's going to be a review of the employer contribution in January 2021. There is no employer contribution to wages for hours not worked in the scheme up to that time, but employers must cover employers' national insurance and employer pension contributions on the full salary paid to their members of staff. So in terms of what we're going to cover in a bit more detail today, I will look at eligibility criteria, both employer and employee. I will also look in more detail at the furlough agreements required. Susan will cover the calculations and claims and then take us through some claims examples, and then I'll pick up on some practical issues and an action plan of actions to take forward. So let's turn first of all to which employers and organisations are eligible to claim under the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme extension. Well, employers, small and large corporates, including charities, are eligible to claim. Employers do not need to have used the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme previously, and employers across the UK can claim whether their businesses are open or closed, whether they're in a certain lockdown requirement or not. It's the same throughout. But in terms of publicly funded organisations, government expects that fully publicly funded organisations will not use this scheme, but partially publicly funded organisations may be eligible where their private revenues have been disrupted. And all other previous Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme eligibility requirements also apply to these employers. But a change in relation to the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, if you like, probably one of the very few carry forwards from the proposed but now postponed Job Support Scheme, is that HMRC say they will publish details of employers who make claims under the extended Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme starting from December. So let's turn now to the employees who are eligible to be furloughed under the Job Retention Scheme extension. Employees who were previously furloughed under the first version of the Job Retention Scheme, which ran up to the 30th of June, which required full furlough, or those who were furloughed in the period up to the 31st of October, those can be claimed for where they're furloughed now going into the new regime. Employees who were hired since the 20th of March and notified by an RTI submission to HMRC on or before the 30th of October will also now be eligible. That is a change. Employees do not need to have been furloughed previously, either before June or October. But there are a couple of exceptions in relation to the timing of when people need to be employed. First of all, for employees who were employed and on the payroll on the 23rd of September this year, but who after that were made redundant or who stopped working for their employer afterwards, can be re-employed and claimed for, and I'll speak about the mechanics of that in a moment, provided the employer made an RTI submission to HMRC for them from the 20th of March through to the 23rd of September, notifying a payment of earnings for them. And similarly, an employee on a fixed term contract who was on the payroll on the 23rd of September this year, but whose contract subsequently expired, can be re-employed and claimed for, again, provided the other eligibility criteria are met. And you can furlough those who are shielding or who have caring responsibilities. So let's look in a bit more detail at that issue. Employees whose health has been affected can be furloughed. So they can be furloughed or remain on furlough where they're unable to work, either because they are shielding themselves in line with public health guidance, and government has issued letters of notification to those who are extremely clinically vulnerable, which indicate that they can be shown to the employer to confirm the need to shield. People can be furloughed also if they need to stay at home with someone who is shielding. People can be furloughed if they're unable to work because they have caring responsibilities resulting from coronavirus, including the employees that need to look after children, or if they become sick when they're already on furlough. The government policy paper says that the job retention scheme is not intended for short-term sickness absences, and employees must always receive at least statutory sick pay when unwell. But employers can decide for their employees who become sick while they're already on furlough, whether they'll keep them on furlough or they'll move them either to statutory sick pay or, if it's available, to contractual sick pay. So let's turn now to what employees can do when the employer is claiming the job retention scheme extension support for them. As for the job retention scheme, employees who, during their furloughed hours, must not do any work for their employer that makes money or provides services for that employer or any organisation linked or associated with it. We cannot stress how important this is. It's extremely important, and therefore it's really key that there is a clear instruction to the employee not to work and that they do not work. But during furloughed hours, an employee can take part in training, but there needs to be clearly some care about any pay in relation to that. They can volunteer for another employer or organisation. They could also, as before, work for another employer, but only if that's permitted by the contract or by the furlough agreement itself. So talking about the furlough agreement, let's turn to look at furlough agreements in a little bit more detail. So if we look at whether we need a new furlough agreement rather than ones that we've already got, well, we know that the policy paper requires employers to discuss this with their staff and make any changes to an employment contract by agreement, and I'll cover that in more detail in a moment. I think it's important just to mention that the terms of the agreement have to reflect the hours the employee has actually worked or not worked over the period of the agreement, and also allow the employer to satisfy the terms of the job retention scheme extension. So if we just look briefly about retrospective agreements, the position with regard to retrospective agreements in the policy paper is that the policy paper has said only retrospective agreements put in place up to and including the 13th of November can be relied on for the purposes of a job retention scheme extension claim. So what we're looking at here will be the position with regard to anybody who is put on furlough, likely after the 5th of November. There might be some before, it's perhaps less likely, where the agreement is made after the furlough period begins. I'll talk about that a bit more when I look at furlough agreements in detail now. So let's turn now to some practical steps in relation to a furlough agreement. The first thing is we are making an employment contract change here. So the first thing you'd likely be looking at is whether existing furlough agreements would qualify. Well, if you had a full furlough agreement and you now want to flexi furlough, it's likely your full furlough agreement will not fit. And if you previously had a flexi furlough agreement on certain terms and you want different terms now, that's not likely to fit either. So it's quite probable, and I would recommend that you have a new furlough agreement that is designed for what you now require. Remember the record-keeping obligation to keep it for 5 years and the need to reflect the hours the employees actually worked or not worked. I do want to emphasise here that there's two criteria that we're looking at. The first is to qualify for the job retention scheme extension grant and what's required. Now, the policy paper in relation to that, whilst requiring the furlough agreement to be in writing, states that the employee does not have to provide a written response for you to be able to claim the job retention scheme extension grant. However, if you are making an employment contract change, it is very wise to get that confirmed in writing. or you may have difficulty in defending a claim later by the employee for the rights before the change was made. And you go about making those changes, first of all, by having discussions with staff. If you've got a collective agreement with a recognised trade union covering a particular bargaining unit, that can assist with regard to getting agreement there. Otherwise, you'll need individual agreement. If there's difficulty in getting individual agreement, it's unlikely because we're in such difficult times, but if there is, there's still the option to dismiss and re-engage on the new terms. But if you were to do that, you need to be careful about collective consultation obligations where you've got 20 or more. And a reminder from the government that where we're making difficult choices as to who has which working pattern, which may well impact on income, that discrimination law requirements must be followed. I wanted to cover also today the changes that you would need to look at because so many furlough agreements were done in a hurry in March. Now we are more experienced. Let's look at what we need to cover. Clearly, as I mentioned earlier, the instruction not to work is very critical and must be in the agreement and not forgotten and very clear. But then we need to specify what pay will be obtained and paid for worked hours. It is expected that employers will pay at the usual rate of pay for worked hours to cover whether benefits will continue, which would be expected. Then what will be the position with regard to pay for furloughed hours? That needs to be specified and properly aligned to the intention to claim for grant, because we don't want there to be a misalignment where employees are expecting one thing, grant is for something less. And a trap there can be the increase in the national minimum wage rates. And also whether benefits will continue during furloughed hours. Clarity as to the start and end dates of a furlough period and any changes to it. The working hours, working days and notification mechanism if we want to make it more flexible. Covering sick pay, particularly contractual sick pay. And holiday accrual. I'll speak about holiday in a bit more in the moment. Making sure we're clear as to training during furloughed hours and also whether there is an entitlement to work elsewhere. It's quite clear, I think, from the policy paper that that agreement has to be made before the beginning of the furlough period to which the claim relates. But there is the flexibility, as I said earlier, in relation to furlough agreements made by this Friday, the 13th of November, which can relate back to an earlier furlough period start. So let's turn now to that slightly more tricky area of re-employing employees with the benefit of the furlough scheme. Now, this isn't straightforward because you need to consider what the gap is between the two employments. And the reason for this is that there was a change in regulation in early April this year, which people might not have spotted. But if there is there needs to be a 4-week gap between one employment ending and the other one starting for there to be a break in the continuity of employment. And the reason for that is that statutory rights accrual will continue. So if you've made somebody redundant and you've paid them a statutory redundancy payment, but you take them back in under a 4-week gap, the continuous employment rights could mean they still have entitlements to a statutory redundancy payment if they were to leave you later, which clearly isn't the optimum position for you. Also, if they have continuity of employment, that rights such as unfair dismissal will continue to accrue. You'll need to consider whether you are going to have a new fixed term, and if so, how long? Is it until January when we're going to have a change, or is it going to be longer? Whether you're going to perhaps be able to vary an existing settlement agreement if the termination has happened very recently, what the new termination date will be and what your mechanism for it, and if you'll need a new settlement agreement. But I also wanted to flag one other point in relation to re-employment, and that's an issue about termination payments. Because termination payments, including statutory redundancy payments, might be an issue if you've now re-employed, because they could become taxable. So one option could be to repay them. If that's not acceptable to the employee, then you'll have to consider if it could perhaps be converted to an employer loan, but that's not without complexity either. So we just wanted to make sure that people were aware that this is not straightforward, but if properly planned, could well work if you feel you'd like to take people back and the other eligibility criteria fit. For this, both the changes have to be worked through as before, as will the timing of the agreement. So I'd like to move on now to holiday. In terms of holiday and the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme extension, holiday will continue to accrue during the furlough period, but if you have more generous contractual holiday accrual than the statutory holiday, you might want to consider whether you want to make a change there. You also want to look carefully at whether the employee can take holiday during worked hours or furloughed hours, and that might be an operational consideration because they can take holiday during either, and there are statutory mechanisms for it. But is that going to work if you have tried carefully to share out the working hours? But remember, you can't furlough those simply because they're on holiday. So if people have a lot of holiday to use up, you can't just furlough them for the holiday they're using up for the remainder of the year. Be careful about holiday pay issues. Making sure that you're clear about the holiday pay rates will be paid for worked hours and non-worked hours. The reference period for holiday pay, remember, it changed to 52 weeks. That was another change from the 6th of April. And the impact of furlough at reduced pay rates previously during that reference period on a week's pay calculation, which we've covered in a previous webinar. And since we're getting towards the end of the calendar year, just a reminder, if people have a calendar year, holiday year, to look forward to people using up their current entitlement and how that will be managed within the context of any furlough agreement. The fact that they are entitled to carry forward some elements of statutory holiday to the next holiday year, and that a new additional right to carry over leave, which is not able to be taken because of COVID circumstances, was also granted on the 26th of March this year. To consider the ability to carry forward any additional contractual holiday on top of those, and then so that you don't store up a significant liability for yourself next year, to be careful about the order in which that holiday will be taken in the following year. And finally, I just wanted to mention the idea of redundancy costs. Many businesses have made their redundancies and we're not looking to make more, but we are in difficult times. I've just reflected here on the slide the position with regard to the ability to source help from the Job Retention Scheme grant up to the 31st of October for redundancy consultation pay costs, notice pay when notice is served, and holiday pay for holiday taken on furlough, which was able to be covered by the Job Retention Scheme, and what it didn't cover, which was statutory redundancy payment in lieu of notice or holiday paid in lieu. We expect the position to be the same, at least up to the 31st of January, but likely up to the 31st of March. That's the indication that we've been given. So I'd now like to pass over to Susan, who's going to talk about the claims and calculations.
Thank you, Carolyn. So as Carolyn said, I'm now going to come and talk a little bit about some of the claims and calculations process and what we have by way of information available at the moment. I know we've actually already had some questions around this. So in relation to employees not claimed for previously under CJRSE, which Carolyn mentioned could be claimed for, we have a new procedure for those. So that's employees who started after the 20th of March, but were on an RTI submission before the 30th of October. So in relation to those, the eligible wages will be for a fixed person. Similarly, as procedures we had for fixed pay for those under the existing rules, you look at the date before the 30th of October in this particular case, and the pay period that fell before then. So bearing in mind the 30th of October is not actually the last day of the month, it was going to be quite important to understand what was paid in relation to that pay period for the fixed pay people who are new. So does that mean that's September pay, or will that mean it's October pay? Will very much depend on the date at which the employee was paid specifically. In relation to the existing people under CJRSE, those who are under the earlier schemes, i.e. the scheme version 1 and version 2, then we're looking for fixed pay people for, again, the period before the 19th of March. So for those individuals who are fixed pay, it's the last pay period before the 19th of March. More likely for most people, that would be February. When we move on to look at variable pay people, for the new people, it's the average pay payable from the start date of their employment or the 6th of April, whichever is the later date, and the day before their extension furlough period begins. So for those employees that are furloughed from the beginning, obviously that'll be the 1st of November, but when you furlough them perhaps later on, it will be from the date the furlough period begins, and we're looking at an average pay calculation again. So we'll come and show how that works later, but basically we're looking at the pay payable between those two dates, and then obviously the day count between those two dates. For the variable people who were existing or not previously eligible, but who could have been eligible, then for variable pay, we're looking at the same calculation as we did before. It's the greater of the 1920 average or the same period last year. So fairly straightforward for those of you who've claimed previously. You will understand what those particular periods mean. I guess the key here is to note that you will absolutely have to work out whether somebody was claimed for previously under the previous scheme, whether they could have been claimed for under the previous scheme, and for those use the original type calculations. For those new employees after the 20th of March who are on an RTI return before the 30th of October, obviously use the new basis of calculation. Now, as Carolyn said earlier, the grant is for 80% of salary for eligible employees up to the 2,500. It's only for that amount, and it does not include anything in relation to national insurance and pension, so it's slightly more straightforward than we had the original calculations under CJRS. So moving on to look at usual hours, well, it follows the same sort of pattern. Again, if you've got a new employee, we're looking at the period for fixed, where the contractual hours were in the last pay period before the 30th of October. If they're new for variables, then we again are looking at from the start date to the date before they went on furlough, and looking at again our average. And for those who were under the previous scheme, we're moving back to for fixed pay. Obviously, we're again still looking back to the pay period before the 19th of March. And for variable pay, the number of hours they worked in the same calendar days last year, or the average number of hours they worked in 1920. So again, as I say, you will, for those of you who've claimed previously, will recognise at least part of it. It's just the difference between those people who are new, i.e. start dates from the 20th of March, that you'll have to deal with differently. So moving on, how can employer claim under the CJRS extension? Well, it'll operate pretty much the same as it did in relation to the last scheme. Employers must report and claim for a minimum period of 7 consecutive calendar days. So this is effectively reflecting what we had in CJRS version 2. So employers need to look to report the actual hours worked and the usual hours for people who are flexi furloughed. And the claim period must start and end within the same calendar month. So we cannot have claim periods that span calendar months. So you'll need to break down pay periods. So for many people, it might be, it's easier to make sure that you make your claim after the end of the month. However, we can make claims, as we did before, in advance. Obviously, for the first claim you're going to make, potentially it's automatically going to be in arrears because we've already passed the 1st of November and we can't start making claims until tomorrow. There's no eligibility gap because obviously this scheme runs on from the other one. So if you had somebody who was on furlough from the 31st of October, then obviously if they were furloughed from the 1st of November, effectively it's a run-on. One of the key criteria, though, going forward, and this I think really, I can't stress enough how important this is going to be. In relation to claims for November, you will only have up until the 14th of December to make a claim. So I'm aware that lots of employers basically have been, saving up some of their claims where they could afford to do so to make sure that they're absolutely correct and they record correctly when people have gone on and off furlough, particularly where they've been flexi furloughed. And sometimes, that's taken some time to get all that information together and make sure it's correct before a claim's gone in. So we're going to have a really tight window now for claims relating to the new scheme where they must be in within 14 days of the following month. So as they said, the first deadline is the 14th of December. We're then going to have the 14th of January. And what with the Christmas period being in the way, obviously we need to be mindful that we can manage that and deal with it accordingly. So if you're making a claim, as I said, you also had to bear in mind the 7 days consecutive calendar days that have to be in a claim if you need to make weekly claims. So if you remember, again, under CJRSE 2, we had this issue with split periods depending on when the month fell, and we're expecting, from what we're told, that that falls the same way. So you might be able to have shorter periods at the beginning and the ending of a month in order to make them align so that you're only making a claim for the month. So when can you claim? Well, I think I've made that clear already. The first available opportunity is actually tomorrow from 8 AM. Obviously, after that, you need to make sure that you are mindful of the date. We would recommend that where at all possible, people try and claim in arrears, primarily because of the point I made earlier in relation to when people are coming on and off furlough and making sure your claim is as accurate as possible. But obviously, clearly, for some employers, the funding is going to be quite important, and you can make effectively claims in advance as you could before, so that you can effectively afford to pay the wages for that particular claim. Another thing to bear in mind is that I know a number of people are still making claims under CJRSE. You really must remember that the deadline for that is the 30th of November, so all claims must be in by the 30th of November for the current previous version of CJRSE version 2. So moving on now to talk about some examples to show how this works and just to refresh people's memories on how we are working in relation to people who were previously eligible. So this is people you claimed for previously under CJRSE version 1 or version 2, or could have been eligible, but you didn't need to claim for them. So how are we doing those calculations? Let's just recap on that. Well, obviously, we start off with somebody, if they're fully furloughed, by looking at the period and saying, testing what the 80% of their income is against the maximum amount that we can claim based on the number of furlough days. I mean, clearly, if they're furloughed for the whole period, it's a lot more straightforward. But otherwise, if we've got furlough days and non-furlough days, then we need to take that into account in our calculation. You might be doing this weekly or you might be doing it daily, depending on how your pay periods work in relation to the claim period. So you need to bear that in mind, and obviously you just adjust the calculation accordingly. For those, again, who were previously furloughed, just to recap, as we said, you look at the fixed being the 19th of March period, so the last pay period before that. So for a lot of people, that will have been February. But it really will depend. If they're not monthly, then obviously it will be the weeks before that, the way you were physically paid. And for the variable pays, again, just to recap, the 1920 average, obviously, or the same period last year. So moving on to look at how that calculates in relation to an example. I'm not going to talk you through the example in a huge amount of detail here, but obviously just to bear in mind, and this is a more complicated one for flexi furloughing, that there's some key points in here. You need to understand, obviously, what their hours were. So what hours did we have? And obviously, what days were they on furlough? So in this particular example, they started working part-time from the 1st of December, Wednesday and Thursday, 7 hours a day, and that's 70 hours in the December period. They normally worked full-time, and they were on a fixed work plan of Monday to Friday for 7 hours. So this is a fixed pay person, so again, somebody who we previously could have claimed for. So we're looking at the last pay before the 19th of March. We're looking at their usual hours for December, and then we have to note, obviously, what the hours are they've actually worked. And we work through those calculations to make sure that we can work out exactly how many hours they should have worked, their usual hours, and then what they did actually work, and therefore what their furlough hours were. Now, I've previously seen people, when they've been doing these calculations under the old scheme, not necessarily take those particular periods into account. It's very important that you go and actually use the correct methodology according to HMRC, and we've started to see HMRC query some previous claims where it doesn't appear that the usual hours minus the hours worked have resulting in the furlough hours under the scheme. So do bear that in mind. And obviously then when you calculate the furlough pay, again, don't forget, and again, some people did do this previously, but you need to test it against the 80%. So don't forget to cap pay where necessary. Bearing that all in mind, of course, what you also must do is this calculation for the furlough pay and for therefore what you can claim, but don't forget, obviously, you're also paying for the hours worked, and that would be at whatever the normal rate of pay is. So I think we've had some questions around what that would be, and that obviously will be impacted by any changes in rates since they were furloughed. So if you have a normal rate of pay for somebody for hours worked, that's what you should be paying there. The furlough pay obviously is a different calculation. So again, just looking at that in relation to a variable paid individual, again, we've got somebody who started on the 1st of December. In this particular case, they're working 50 hours. They're variable. So we're again looking at somebody who was previously eligible. So we need to look at the equivalent period last year and also the average. So we've got the two calculations to take into account, and then we look at the higher amount. And then we work our way through, obviously, the calculations in the same way. Not forgetting, of course, that where we need to, we might need to cap the calculation depending on what the individual's pay is. And again, once you've worked out the furlough hours, you obviously need to take into account what the hours and the pay should be for the hours they actually worked, and that might be a different amount. So those are the steps to take you through in order to do a calculation so that you can go forward in relation to those individuals who were previously furloughed or could have been previously furloughed under CJRSE version 1 and 2. So what about those in relation to the new version and the extension for employees who have been employed since the 20th of March, so missed out on the last version of the scheme up to the 30th of October. So they were on an RTI and have received a payment between those period of times. Well, again, we look at the same type of calculation in relation to working out, obviously, what we do in relation to the cap. The key point, as we mentioned before, is that the wages for these individuals will be the last full pay period ending on or before the 30th of October. So you'll need to look at what that pay period is and then apply that to the calculation. Again, this is for a fully furloughed individual, and obviously you would need to take into account the furlough days where they're not fully furloughed. For those who are variable pay, you only have the one calculation. It's the average payable between the start date of their employment or the 6th of April, whichever is later, and the pay before the furlough extension, i.e. the furlough period then now begins. So again, it's the pay paid to them or payable to them during that period. And then you perform the calculations and obviously work out what they're entitled to be paid. So how does that work in practice? Again, I've used a similar example, but the key feature here is really to remind you that absolutely you're looking, in this particular case, for those new people at the payroll and the pay period paid before the 20th of October. And again, when you're doing the usual hours calculation, it's a similar basis. So this is somebody who's flexi furloughed, so we've got that usual hours calculation in there, but clearly if they weren't flexi furloughed, it's just the whole period that you need to take into account, and obviously the pay before the 20th of October for somebody who's fixed. So moving on, similarly, we've repeated the example here, but the key feature, of course, for this particular person is, again, to look at that average period, and we're only looking at the one average period here rather than having the two-step calculation. And you would need to look at the average hours and the average pay, and then factor that into the steps that we took previously. Bear in mind, again, also not to miss off the fact that you need to take into account the cap where necessary. So what if you make mistakes under the scheme or even, in fact, obviously CJRSE itself, because some people are still obviously dealing with that and we still have claims going in up until the 30th. Well, if you've overclaimed the current CJRSE, then you really do need to make sure that you correct that. You have up until the date of final claims. To reiterate again, that's the 30th of November for CJRSE. When we go forward, as we're claiming under the new scheme, obviously, again, you'll have similar procedures to deal with how you deal with corrections for those should you make a mistake. But just to recap on this, you can correct in your next claim. So if you haven't made your last claim, you're still able to do that. You can correct, obviously, against that claim. You should make that payment, if at all possible, to HMRC if you've overclaimed, as soon as you are aware that you've overclaimed. So if you aren't able to do that and adjust a claim that's already been made, then you should request from HMRC a payment reference and make that payment as soon as possible. We're expecting, again, as before, that if you had an error in a claim and you just submitted it, so within 72 hours, you can delete it and start again. But please be mindful for CJRSE that deadline of the 30th of November, and that is important. So you must make that particular deadline. So why is this all important? Well, we do have penalty legislation, unfortunately, around, and you can be penalised for obviously claiming grants you're not entitled to. Now, for those of you who are claiming under CJRSE, you'll remember that the first deadline we had was the 20th of October, this being 90 days after the Finance Act received royal assent and related to any claims that were effectively received by an employer before the 22nd of July. The penalty legislation is still in place and effectively applies a penalty 90 days after you receive a grant you're not entitled to. So the window, the penalty-free window, is 90 days after you've received the grant, and that's on a rolling period. Or also 90 days from when the circumstances change such that you realise you are no longer entitled to keep the grant. So we have that particular penalty, and we also have penalties which are tax and geared based ones. And if you deliberately failed to report it and concealed the fact that you'd claimed a grant when you weren't entitled to receive it, you could actually have a further penalty of up to 100% being charged. So the onus very much from HMRC and government is on people to look at their claims and make sure they're correct. Really quickly, just to point out that we can and are getting letters from HMRC sent out on previous claims. If you get one of these, please don't panic. Note the deadline in the letter. I mean, this one's well and truly passed, but make sure you do respond to those letters if they have a deadline in them by the deadline. Have a think about whether you think there's anything wrong with your claim. Review it if you haven't done already, and make sure that you contact HMRC. Consider whether you need to take professional advice in relation to how you've submitted your claim and any problems with that, bearing in mind what I previously said. So now I'm going to pass over to Carolyn to take us through some practical issues and an action plan.
Thank you, Susan. So let's turn now to some of the practical issues in relation to both the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme claims corrections and also the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme extension claims. And we've shown here a summary, if you like, of the areas that you need to work through. Either you'll be working through, as Susan just explained, to make sure that your claims are correct, that you have everything in place, or if you have notified or need to notify any corrections, then this is a very good way to work through whether that's a requirement. And then with regard to the claims that you are about to embark on and the people that you either have just furloughed or about to furlough very shortly, again, a good summary of the topics that we've covered today and the points that you need to think about. We have had questions about several of the points which have come through here, but I think that we have actually covered quite a lot of them as we've gone through the presentations. But just remember, for example, little traps like top-ups for training. If people are training while they're on furlough, then we need to make sure that they are being paid the national minimum wage where that's appropriate, and also top-ups for annual leave, etc. So just really to flag for you the overall summaries of what you look at. Are the employees eligible? What did you actually agree? How did you work out the reference pay and the hours inputs, which Susan has gone through? How you did those calculations, which reference period you're looking at. It's become more complex now. And then the really important thing as to whether you have actually paid the employees correctly according to what you said in the furlough agreements you would do. And that's a particular area where we have seen people using sort of standard form furlough agreements, which didn't correctly reflect what the employer wanted to claim and therefore didn't correctly reflect what was actually being paid and has caused all sorts of problems. So I'd now like to turn to what you should do now to bring together the points which we have covered today. The first thing you would want to do, and probably are currently doing, is assessing the impact of the changed trading conditions on your workforce. And you'll be looking at whether you can claim and whether you wish to claim. And the reason you'll be looking at whether you wish to claim is with one eye to the fact that your name will be published from December if you do choose to claim, but also being aware that you can claim whether your business is open or closed and there's no distinction between sites there. Another thing to be careful of is those who may have got ahead of things very sensibly, it appeared at the time, and entered into agreements with staff under what was proposed to be the job support scheme, where there the minimum changed, but it settled down to 20% of minimum working hours. Now, you may have entered an agreement with a member of staff indicating you're going to give them a minimum of 20% of their working hours, but is that actually what you want to do under the job retention extension scheme? And so you may have to unwind that agreement and make sure you've got a new agreement with what you do intend to do under the job retention scheme extension. And you will still be, sadly, looking at whether the roles can continue and assessing whether you can get any workforce support in relation to the job retention scheme extension if you have to make redundancies. We knew that was not available under the job support scheme, but it does appear that it is available under the job retention scheme extension. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we need to make sure that both we've got our furlough agreements in place and that we've made any contract changes needed. And a reminder that if you are furloughing for a period before the relating back from now, that you will, because you furloughed earlier and you want to claim for that period, you need to have that agreement in place by the 13th of November. Otherwise, you're going to only be able to claim for claim periods where you've had the agreement in place first. A really important point is to plan the claims process in advance. There was never time to do this in March and April. There wasn't time to properly prepare for keeping an audit trail. But bearing in mind you might not be making your first claim until early December, then we think we would really recommend that you get all your documentation in place. You keep a record of who you're furloughing. The audit trail is there. You're sure that there's processes in place to make sure the records are there as well, because we know that the record keeping is required. We know that they have to be kept for 6 years, although the agreement for 5 years. And it's worth investing the time now that you can so that it's not more challenging for you if and when you get an audit. Susan has mentioned it several times, so making sure that you've completed your furlough claims under the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme up to 31 October by 30 November, and also those corrections, notifications, and any adjustments that have to be made. And all of this is going to require significant consultation with the staff as well. So just a reminder there that a useful thing is to make sure we've got staff engagement surveys regularly used. And then I'm sure you all know this because it's been a feature of life for all of us for the last 8 months who've been using the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. But be careful that if there are any updates to the Job Retention Scheme extension and the legislation and the full scheme when it comes out today, to make sure that you keep up to date with all of those, specifically if there are any changes in relation to different claim periods.
Hello, this is Carolyn Brown. After this presentation and recording were made, HMRC published the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme Extension Guidance. Please note that the published guidance states that as an employer you can claim grant if you cannot maintain your workforce because your operations have been affected by coronavirus, and as a result you can furlough employees and apply for a grant. The scheme also stated that government is reviewing whether employers will be eligible to claim grant for employees serving contractual notice or statutory notice periods, and that government will change the approach for claim periods starting on or after the 1st of December. Also, the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme Extension published scheme does not include the policy paper requirement that the furlough agreement must reflect the hours the employee has actually worked or not worked over the period of the agreement.
Thank you very much to you both. And yes, we do have quite a few questions, so I'm going to try and group them together. And whilst some of the questions would have been posed before that relevant content was covered, there may be a bit of duplication, but apologies, we're trying to get as many answers as we can. So firstly, and it may well be one that you just have touched upon, Carolyn, but it's around the agreements being made in advance, and there's one particularly around how you make an agreement when you don't actually know the hours that somebody's going to work under flexi, and a few other ones in terms of the actual agreements that need to be made. So maybe if you could elaborate on a couple of those points.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, this is a tricky area. First of all, in relation to what the agreement has to say concerning the furlough or flexi furlough period. I did read for you earlier, and we put it on the slide, that the requirement to reflect the periods worked and not worked. And that is challenging because maybe you can plan that well or you can't. And I think there are different approaches here. Some people are saying, well, you can put in your agreement that people will work such hours, such times as will be agreed from time to time. I do have concerns that that's not a wise approach, and therefore I think if you know how you're going to start off, perhaps a period of full furlough, then you might put that in the agreement with absolute clarity that you can flexi furlough. If you're clear what the period is, or what the periods, structure of the periods may be in relation to a flexi furlough, then you would include that. And one workaround that I'm using for this is to have a broadly based agreement, but with as much specifics in it as possible, but also having perhaps a drawdown sheet or a term sheet which people can sign up to if we have to change things, because we really do want to make sure that we've got the record keeping where it needs to be for the purpose of any audit. And clearly, if the agreement matches the claim periods, it's going to be so much more straightforward if you do get challenged on this.
Thank you. A couple now sort of technical points. One maybe for Susan. Around new starters, I know that back in March, if we cast our mind back, there was a lot of talk around people who hadn't been submitted on an RTI by the 19th of March. Again, we've got a few questions around people's October payroll, whereby pay date was maybe the 31st of October, and therefore some new starters in October were first submitted via RTI on the 31st, or maybe even later up to the 5th of November. And clarification, unfortunately, that's ineligible as those new starters in March were.
That's right, Steve. Yes, you do need to be mindful, obviously, of when somebody started, when you made an RTI submission for them. So for the individuals we're talking about who have recently started, they needed to have been on an RTI submission with a payment that went to HMRC before the 30th, or on or before the 30th. If they missed that because the pay period was the 31st for some reason, or just they missed it, then that is an issue. It's the same issues you said we had with the 19th of March. Clearly, if you missed the 19th of March before, then you would potentially be somebody who could be on the scheme now going forward. So you do need to bear in mind the two different calculations, and I know we've had quite a number of questions around why that is, and also why people are still being paid on furlough based on a pay period that was back in 1920, or March or February 19. Unfortunately, that is the calculation. Clearly, what you agreed to pay them may be different. But that is the calculation that you have to do from HMRC's perspective. You only have those two options for people who were previously eligible, or for the new ones, the different calculation.
And that's brilliant, and that does transition into the next set of questions. You've answered some of them there, and because there are a number, as you say, around people who were eligible and maybe were furloughed in April and may have come back for a few months in between. And now, and in those cases, their average may be significantly higher, but they've been working recently compared to what it was back in the 1920 tax year. But as Susan's confirmed there, the key point is if they were eligible first time round, that's the average you use. It literally just it's a question of was there eligibility or not. As always, we probably will run out of time in terms of getting through all these questions, and I will put the slide with contact details of all of us after if we don't get round to your question. But again, trying to group them up to get as many answers as we can. Susan, a couple of questions around the calculations and kind of how those the detail of the calculations that we saw changed quite a bit in the early days. When do we expect to see that detail of the calcs?
So yes, in relation to obviously what we shared with you today, that's based on our understanding of it is at the moment. What we are expecting by the way of HMRC additional guidance is exactly that, Steve, is a huge number of examples to come out later today so that people can work their way through those examples ready to claim should they wish to do so, and particularly that will be relevant for those weekly payrolls. Tomorrow morning. So if you are in that position, obviously take what we've given you so far. I would recommend that you check that when the HMRC guidance comes out later today with all those different worked examples and different permutations so that you can see, hopefully something that best fits you, because we've obviously only gone through a couple of examples here, and then based on that.
Thank you. Probably time for just a couple more. One of them's an interesting one, which has got the potential to then become a little bit tricky. Is there any need to link a period where there is no work to whether it's COVID related or just whether that employee would have no work during that period anyway? So, for example, seasonality. I think the answer is no. I think if you're putting someone onto furlough now, there isn't the need to actually look in December and say what would they be working, because you're back to the averages, which is either the averages for the 1920 year, or if they're recently eligible, then it's the average for the more recent period. Is that along the right lines?
So shall I pick up the eligibility point there of people with seasonality, etc.? I think we've got to be a little bit careful about where people might not have been planned to have been working anyway. So we had some questions about the planned shutdown period. So if the legislation requires people not to be working because of the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. So if actually they are not planned to be working, I think that still is an issue. However, the position with regard to the calculations is slightly different, but just be a little bit careful. We did have a question earlier about people who were intending to furlough people either side of a planned shutdown. That may well be okay.
Thank you. I think that's it proves the point that some of these things are complicated areas, and do reach out if there are any further questions specifically. I make no apologies that we won't. Well, I do apologise that we won't be able to get through all of your questions. As I say, coming on to one of the next slides will be our contact details. So we will need to, in the interest of time and finishing on time, and move on. Just in terms of how RSM can help, the slide there will show some areas that we are able to help you with if you did need assistance in those areas. The next slide should have our the slides will all be circulated with you, so you can catch up on those as we move through them. I always make the point here in pointing out the preference centre. The link on the screen currently is the preference centre. Whilst you are on the webinar today, it means that you have received an invite in some way. If you would like to extend what you hear from us out, that will give you an option to choose all the topics available to you that we produce content on and circulate that to you. So please do update your preferences. Some links there to our content and recent webinars can all be viewed via these links. And that remains to thank you all for joining us and to our speakers. The next Employment Matters event is scheduled for the 10th of December. And until then, best wishes to you all from the RSM People Advisory Team, and stay well.